Hello, in this lecture we're going to continue our discussion of oligopoly and antitrust policy, chapter 15. Remember that the goals are to explain the distinguishing characteristics of oligopoly, distinguish two models of oligopoly, describe two empirical methods of measuring market structure, explain what antitrust policy is, and give a brief history of it. So first, let's take a review of what we have so far. This is kind of like our spectrum of where we could be in terms of perfect competition over here, and then all the way over here with monopoly power, and just recap those different types of markets that we could have. So if we are sitting here on the monopoly power, then number of firms, 1. They have complete control over whatever monopoly power they have monopoly power in. Barriers to entry, significant barriers to entry. That's one of the reasons that one person can get monopoly power, is because there's significant barriers to entry. Pricing decisions, we're still going to produce most of the time, almost all the time when we're thinking independently, we're going to produce where marginal costs equal marginal revenue. And then the output decisions, most output restriction, meaning we're going to end up producing less than we would if we had other types of competition in there. That's how we're going to take advantage of our monopoly power in a way. Interdependence, no competitors, so there's no interdependence. And price and marginal cost, price is going to be greater than the marginal cost. If we think about oligopoly, so that's going to be close to the monopoly, but we have a few firms involved in it, so we don't have a lot of competition. We got a few actors in it, and they're very reliant on each other for that reason. They're really looking at each other. So number of firms, there's going to be a few of them. Barriers to entry, it's still significant. That's why there's only a few firms. And so there's still significant barriers to entry. Pricing decisions. The only case where we're not going to produce, where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, is here in the oligopoly, because we're thinking about what the other person is doing. The fact that we're looking at what the other person is doing and not making decisions basically solely independently means that we're going to use strategic pricing. We're going to price strategically, meaning we might have sticky prices. We might try to collude in some kind of way with the other firms so that we can get more monopoly power by setting prices. And output decisions, we're going to have output restrictions again. So unlike a perfect competition, we're still going to have some restrictions. Interdependence decisions, meaning the decisions that somebody else makes a big impact on us in an oligopoly. And then price and marginal cost, price is going to be greater than marginal cost. And then we have monopolistic competition. This one always used to seem kind of weird to me because it sounds like it's closer to monopoly, but it's actually closer to perfect competition, meaning that we're not sitting at perfect competition, but we're on this side of the spectrum. We're closer to perfect competition than to the monopoly side. The number of firms is going to be a lot of them then. It's not going to be like infinite, like our theory of perfect competition, but there's going to be a good amount of firms in there in a monopolistic competition. Barriers to entry, there's are few of them. And note there's always going to be some barriers to entry, so it's just a matter of how many are in there. In monopolistic competition, there's going to be more firms, less barriers to entry, and which is one reason why there's more firms in there. And we're going to produce, like all the time, when we are making decisions for ourselves and not kind of considering the other individual, like in an oligopoly, we will be producing where marginal cost equals marginal revenue. Output decisions, output restricted product differentiation. So what this means is that there's going to be some differentiation. What we're trying to do in a monopolistic competition, like any time, is try to differentiate our product a bit. And therefore, by differentiating from everything else, we still have the substitute out there, but we're going to try to get some market power by having that differentiation. Interdependence, each firm is interdependent, and price and marginal cost, price is going to be greater than marginal cost. Then we have perfect competition. Remember, this is like an ideal situation, so we can be very close to this in some markets, but we never really get there entirely. You'll see what I mean as we go through it. But this is the model that we start off with, because that's the base model that we can basically kind of build everything else from. So number of firms, almost infinite. Now again, that's, of course, you can't have an infinite number of firms, but we can have a situation where there's so many firms that we really have no market power. That's what we're talking about here. That's not really where we want to be. We want to differentiate ourselves and get some market power, but that's the situation. Barriers to entry, almost none. Again, there's always some kind of cost that you're going to have to, even a hot dog stand, you got to buy the hot dogs in the stand and whatnot, but there's a lot less barriers to entry for that than a lot of other things. Pricing decisions, we're going to have marginal cost equals marginal revenue equals price in this case of perfect competition. Output decisions, no output restrictions, so there's no restrictions there. Interdependence, each firm is interdependent, and price and marginal cost we're going to produce where price equals marginal cost. Okay, so now we're going to go into antitrust policy, so judgment by performance or structure. So when we think about antitrust, we have this idea of we have these monopolies now, and there's a question of, well, what are we going to do with these monopolies? Is it fair that we have this monopoly power for the first part, and what is it good for the market, and should we break them up? And the antitrust policies are ideas that are kind of like a referee in terms of how big or how the government should referee the monopolistic power of organizations. So we need to set some rules, we need some guidance, we need to have some laws that everybody knows and can abide by in terms of monopolies and how they're going to be regulated. So antitrust policy is the government's policy toward competitive process. There are two competing views of competition. Judgment by performance, we should judge the competitive of markets by performance of the firms in the market, meaning it doesn't matter how big they are in this case, it matters how they act. So even though we're basically looking at big firms, oftentimes when we think about antitrust, in this view, we're saying, hey, if they did competition and they got there legitimately through legitimate means by legitimate competition, then we don't deserve to break them up. But if they did unfair practices that we think are not within the rule book that we're setting up here, then that's when they can take action under the antitrust policy. And then the other view of it is judgment by structure. We should judge the competitiveness of markets by the structure of the industry. And that's just the idea of saying, hey, this company is a monopoly and there's harm for the market for that reason. Even if they got there fairly, even if they had fair competition and they basically won in the market, we still have an obligation for the good of competition, for the good of the consumer, to basically break up a monopoly in that situation. Those are the two kind of extreme judgments on this. So Standard Oil is a classic monopoly case, judging market competition by performance. So Standard Oil Trust used its monopoly power to close refineries, raise prices, and limit the production of oil. So the Sherman Act of 1890, a law designed to regulate the competitive process. So we had a law that's trying to regulate how the competitive process will work. The U.S. Supreme Court determined that Standard Oil controlled 90% of the market, that it was a monopoly and guilty of unfair business practices. So note what we're saying here. Standard Oil, at a time, of course, when oil was very important, we're using oil to light our houses before we have electricity. Oil became a very important commodity, and what happened is Standard Oil basically monopolized the market, and the fact that they were a monopoly was a problem in and of itself, because it's a question of whether that's good for the market or not. But note that what the law is saying that they did, they're trying to judge their monopoly power not based on the fact that they're a monopoly, but based on the fact that they did unfair business practices, such as kind of bullying other companies to leave the market. And the way we could do that, one way that that could happen, is that we could have price discrimination, meaning if we have a small competitor in this one location, we could put our oil refinery next to them and actually set the price lower than our production costs, even though the rest of our country, the rest of our oil is at a higher price. And obviously the reason we're doing that is just to run someone out of business. And so these type of practices that are completely geared, of course, to run other businesses out of business in order to gain monopoly power, those are the ideas of unfair business practices that was determined here to be the problem, even though they're kind of going after Standard Oil because they're big, because they have a monopoly. So the resolution was to break up Standard Oil into small companies. So action was taken in this case. They broke up Standard Oil. They said, hey, you're a monopoly, you had unfair business practices, we're going to break you up under the Sherman Act. Clayton Antitrust in 1914 identified specific practices of illegal monopolists. So you can take a look at those. Standard Oil's judgment by competitive by performance. The structure performance distinction was also used in the case involving U.S. Steel. So U.S. Steel, another example of a monopoly industry. Clearly steel came along, of course, and we started to make big buildings and whatnot, and bridges and things like that. And then the steel became a very important commodity in that at that point in time and was fairly new when it first came on the scene, and then of course it was very important. So the Supreme Court ruled that although steel controlled a majority of the market and was a structural monopoly, it was not a monopoly in performance, meaning they were a monopoly, and you could argue, well, that's not good for competition, it's not good for the market to have someone be a monopoly. But under the laws at the time, they said, hey, you know what, they did it fairly. They didn't go and run other steel companies out of the market. They competed fairly, and they got control of the market with basically a fairly new resource at the time that was developed and got monopoly power. Therefore, U.S. Steel had not used unfair business practices to become a monopolist. It was not in violation of the antitrust law for that reason. So even though we kind of think of the antitrust law as there to break up monopolies, at this point in time or under this view, even though that's kind of the purpose, it's only going to act if basically there was these unfair practices in order to get that monopoly power. So unlike Standard Oil, U.S. Steel was not required to break up into small companies. So they didn't suffer kind of the same fate of being broken up through this law. Then we have ALCOA case, judging market competitiveness by structure. So judgment by performance was the primary criteria governing antitrust policy in 1945. So now we have the precedent being that it's not being monopoly in and of itself, it is the practices that make someone a monopoly, and that's when the rules will be broken in terms of the law. That's when a company can be broken up. But that was kind of not upheld here in that ALCOA basically was held to have fair business practices, become a monopoly, and still be broken up because they were a monopoly. So they were Aluminum Company of America, ALCOA, the only producer of aluminum in U.S., but did not use unfair business practices to become a monopolist. So ALCOA used its knowledge of a market to expand its capacity before competitors could enter the market. So they basically, once again, got this new technology, and they jumped into the market, and they got a hold of the market basically before anybody else could enter, and that's how they became the monopoly. And that was not unfair. They didn't run anybody out of the market and do any of these unfair acts, although they have market power. And the courts focused on the structure of the market and ruled that ALCOA to be a violation of the antitrust laws. So note what they said here. They said, we understand that you didn't do it unfairly. However, simply by the fact that you are a monopoly, we need to regulate that. And again, you can see why that kind of needs to happen, but you can see why there's some reservations to do it as well, because it seems a little less fair to break them up if they didn't do unfair business practices. So judging markets by structure or performance, the reality of the situation. Judging by structures is practical, though seemingly unfair. So that's kind of the perception. If a firm is competing so successfully that all other firms leave the industry, the successful firm will be a monopolist. So the idea being that it would make sense for us to make the rule that we're going to determine someone to be a monopoly and therefore apply antitrust policies and maybe break up the monopoly once we determine that, because it's easy to determine that. We can determine much more easily whether someone is a monopoly than we can to see if they had unfair business practices or whatnot. That's a lot more difficult of a situation, and we could make the argument, of course, that for the good of the market, we got to maintain competition. But on the other hand, of course, the whole point of business, the point of competition is to win fairly. And if they didn't violate any rules, just like if a player of a football season played perfectly and they had a perfect season and they didn't break any rules, it seems unfair to claim that you can't do that. So that's why there's some hesitation there. Judging by performance, each action of a firm must be analyzed on a case-by-case basis, which is difficult. So if we're trying to judge their performance, a little more difficult. Structural and performance criteria have ambiguities. There are no definite criteria for judging whether a firm has violated the antitrust status. So when we think about how they're going to apply antitrust policy and whether a company is too big and has too much monopoly power today, tough to call because there's been precedent on either side. So recent antitrust enforcement that could be worth looking into Since the 1980s, the government have been more lenient on antitrust cases because of change in American ideology. Of course, the change of how we're going to think is going to change over time. Globalization of U.S. economy. As we compete and as things become more competitive and we become more connected with the world, there's a question of, well, if we break up some of our larger industries, are we harming the industry or the overall economy when we're competing with other countries? That's an open question to take a look at. The increasing complexity of technology. So obviously, many of the areas where we're growing is in the area of technology. And that brings the competition together. That makes us more competitive in all industries. And also, it's just a question of technology firms that are getting monopoly power. Is the technology industry somehow, do we have to approach it somewhat differently when we think about monopoly power in that sector? So there have been recent important computer and technological cases. So Microsoft is going to be a case. You can take a look at that and research into Microsoft, and obviously, they have the operating system and they have software. And one of the things that they did that was very clever to do was to basically have a computer, sell the computer with the software on it, and basically kind of give away the software. And by doing that, then they've combined the software with the operating system, and they've put these things together, which could be seen as not fair, basically, because they're running out the other people in the market and whatnot. So you can take a look at Microsoft, and then AT&T. We know that the phones are kind of like a natural monopoly, so they're always taking a look at to see if the phone companies are gaining too much monopoly power. And there's been recent information on that, and these are always two areas that are continually something to keep an eye on, as to whether they're being in danger of being declared a monopoly.